How is it going, guys? I hope you're doing well. My name is Jordan and we're going to be talking about periodization today. Now, some of you may or may not have heard about periodization, and that's completely fine, depending on what level you're at. So whether you're level 2 fitness instructor just getting into the industry, whether you're a level 3 PT, whether you're studying for high level qualifications like a level 4 or a master's. Okay, depending on what level you're at, you may have heard of it, you may not have, or your understanding of it might be a little bit different or a little bit skewed, and that's completely fine. But today we're just going to go over a little bit of a brief history of where it comes from and how it got to what it is today, and then also talking about the different methods that we actually have and who the best for, and what maybe the limitations or criticisms are of that. Now, when we're talking about periodization, the earliest way that we've seen periodization being used is during the early Olympic years. So the very early Olympic athletes would follow phases such as a prep phase and a competition phase, followed by then a rest phase, and ultimately that is the fundamental underlayer of what periodization is. And when we actually look into the different ways that we periodize and how we actually go about making training adaptations more effectively applied, then that'll make more sense. Now, with early periodization, it was very unsystematic and it was more intuitive, so we kind of knew what we needed to do, but the methods that we used were not very good and they weren't very effective in what the outcome should be. Now, since the early days, that's obviously come along a lot since then, and we're a lot more informed now. Back then, there was practically no research, and for what little research there was, the accessibility of that research was practically non-existent. Very few people could get their hands on that research, which made it really difficult for people very early into fitness and sports to properly train. Now, you've started off with the early Olympic athletes, and then following that we then enter kind of the early 20th century, where we'll see physical education teachers and military trainers begin to show a little bit more understanding of periodization and more effective training methods being applied, and we can actually see that begin to develop very early on, whilst they're experimenting with different methods of physical conditioning, whether that's resistance training or whether that is more cardio based. And like I said, it was very unsystematic and it was more intuitive, so the approaches that they took were not methodical, and like I said, it's more about experimenting with different methods and different techniques to come to a little bit of a conclusion of what works best and what doesn't. And obviously we know that a one-size-fits-all program means absolutely nothing. There's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all program. You can look at different guidelines, and different guidelines do very similar things across everyone, but there's practically no one-size-fits-all program that you can use. And it was very early into periodization where we would actually see that moving away from a one-size-fits-all to a more individualized method. Now, going from the early 20th century, we'll then move into the mid and the late 20th century. Now, modern periodization has essentially stemmed from the Soviets, and the Soviets, a researcher by the name of Medvedev, essentially designed and devised the earliest format of periodization and recognized the different phases of it. Now, Medvedev formalized that concept, but he also used Honsellier's general adaptation syndrome, which you can check out in my previous video. But that gas principle is what we're really talking about, and Medvedev recognized that was really important. He recognized that we can utilize that a lot better than what we are currently, and that's when he formalized the concept of periodization and developed proper way to train. So introducing those proper periods, or phases should I say, in which training should be completed to be able to get the most effective outcome. Now, the gas principle was really important for that, because it allowed them to understand that obviously when you train you'll fatigue, then when you fatigue you recover back to baseline, and then enter the supercompensation phase, where you'll then get a little bit stronger, or depending on what the training aim was for that session, you'll develop a little bit further into that than what baseline was. Now, most of the time it's not a lot, but it was a little bit, and it was using that to then devise a little bit of a plan to say, okay, what we need to do is we need to gradually increase intensity to make sure that we continue pushing the body to its limit, and ensure that adaptations are actually occurring more frequently rather than sporadically. And that's where regular training comes in, and the type of training that we use is more effectively understood. Now, Medvedev essentially introduced a structure of training phases, and we'll look at that as the macro cycle, which is easiest way to understand that is the annual or the overall cycle. You've then got the mesocycle, which is then more monthly blocks or multiple months in a block, and then finally you've got the microcycle, which is more about weekly blocks. Now, the macro cycle can be 1 year, it could be 2 years, it could be 4 years. Just like the early Olympic athletes, they would use a 4-year cycle where they do preparation for likely 3 years, and then a year of competition prep, followed by then a little bit of rest time following that. And with mesocycles, it could be per month, it could be for a 3-month block, it could be for a 6-month block. That's just different ways that you can look at it. And then microcycles will likely always be weekly blocks. Now, with that created the foundation for modern periodization, and Medvedev essentially branded that new structure of periodization, and that would raise the standards in terms of sports performance and fitness performance for a variety of different activities. Now, with that, it then came the introduction of peaking strategies, where we'll then look at competition phases, and we will gain a lot more understanding of how we properly prep for the competition, and then how we maintain peak performance during that competition phase, whether that's only a period of a few days, a week, maybe even a couple months. It's about maintaining the high performance that you've prepped for previously, and that's where we kind of got that popularity in strength and conditioning, and how we recognized that was really important for sports, and how we used that to develop the sports, develop training for different sports, to effectively make athletes better physically and tactically. Now, with that peaking strategy, you'll then obviously see double and triple peaks, maybe even more, depending on the type of sport that you're in. And that's essentially just for more about, like, let's say powerlifters, for example, where they might do multiple meets per year. So they might do 2 or 3 meets per year, maybe a couple more. Might even be for different types of competitions. So sprinters, for example, might go to different competitions throughout the year, in the different quarters, so they'll have to have multiple peaks during the year. So it's just the way that they're used and utilized. And when it comes down to entering the later portion of the 20th century and earlier 21st century, we're now looking at how we integrate technical and tactical strategies in terms of how we program around them. And it was about understanding how technical skills and how tactical strategies impacted athletes, and how the demands changed based on what those technical and tactical demands were, and the physiological changes that we've seen. And this is more important for sports like football or basketball, where we had to recognize that it's not just the aerobic system being used just because the longer periods of time that they're exercising for or taking part for and competing for, but it's also the type of activity that they're doing. So it's not just, a nice run for 90 minutes for football, for example. We're talking about a lot of intermittent high-speed runs where we're talking about a couple minutes per run. We could be talking about doing very frequent sprints of, you know, a few seconds to up to 10 to 15 seconds. We're talking about how those demands interpret how we go about training athletes. And it was that technical and tactical integration that really changed sport in terms of how we really meet their demands and how we plan and properly emphasize those training adaptations that are needed to meet the sport's demands. Now, like I was saying, 20th century and the early 21st century, this is where more modern methods of periodization began to come in. They were going to thrive. It allowed us to use things like undulating or nonlinear periodization. They really blossomed in terms of sports, and what I mean by that is we're not just talking about using the same type of training consistently for, let's say, 3 months. We're talking about using multiple types of training, either daily or weekly, to elicit different types of adaptations, and it just mixes up training a lot, which means that athletes get less bored and they also develop multiple areas instead of just one, which is counterproductive for most athletes in sports because they need to be working on multiple things at once rather than just focusing on one specific thing. Now, for sports like powerlifting, for example, it's not as important. The technical and that type of side to it, because they'll have technical mastery already. It's just about building up strength, speed and power in preparation for their competitions, whereas sports like football or basketball, where they'll not only have to develop strength, speed, power, they'd also have to look at aerobic endurance, they'd have to look at anaerobic capacity, so it was a lot more in those types of sports compared to traditional powerlifting or weightlifting, where there's not as much. You already have that technical mastery. It's just about emphasizing the physical element. And those sports like football and basketball, there are specific elements to that where you look at the technical and the tactical demands of the sport and how they differ, and that's where those non-linear or undulating periodization methods come in and really blossom in the early 21st century and the late 20th century. Now, in terms of undulating periodization, what we're really looking at is the manipulation of different variables. So that could be the frequency of training, so how often, could be the intensity of the training. So if they are doing low volume, the intensity should be really high to maintain that, especially during a competition phase where they want to limit how much training they're doing so that they can maximize how much effort they can put into proper competition performance. So it's about balancing them properly in the build up and then during the competition phase. In terms of more contemporary periodization, especially in the last 10 or 15 years, we've become a lot more hypercritical of non-training elements that influence athlete performance, and what we're really looking at there is psychological, nutritional and then also recovery strategies that have made their way into periodization, which allows us to create more flexible but also inflexible methods of periodization, which can create some issues for athletes. So it might mean that they have less autonomy over what they can do. So it's more about strict training schedules and strict eating plans and strict recovery methods being implemented, where they don't really have much of a say, which isn't that good because it's obviously not very flexible for them. But then we also see more flexible approaches coming in, like auto-regulation, where they'll actually look at how the athlete feels on the day, and how they feel comfortable doing different types of activities. So, for example, we've got some powerlifters, or strongmen should I say, the way that they train is very much more flexible, and they'll judge what they'll lift or how much they'll lift what volume they might use based on how they're feeling, and because they're working with such heavy weight, it's more important for them to use that self-regulation so that they actually better understand their limits, should I say, their physiological limits for themselves at that moment, rather than push themselves too far just because someone's told them that they have to do this specific thing, which is obviously inflexible and also increases the risk of injuries. So ultimately, there are different ways of doing it. There's flexible ways, there's inflexible ways, and what we're really looking at is different types of models where we'll have things like linear periodization, where that's very much a basic way to look at periodization. So you'll start off with high volume, low intensity, and then as you gradually build up that intensity, your volume should then decrease to balance that out. Now that's really good for beginners, people who want to develop strength, and people who are in hypertrophy phases. It's really good for them, and it's predictable, it's simple to implement, it's boss for beginners. Now for nonlinear or undulating periodization, what we're really looking at is variation in volume and intensity, and that can be within short cycles, so that's daily or weekly undulating. And they're really important for team sports where you need to develop different parts of the athlete in short periods of time, or you can't neglect certain parts of the athlete's development without risking performance, and that also helps with injury prevention, and that's really good for advanced athletes where they can actually cope with higher intensities within shorter cycles, or variation within a week, or variation across multiple weeks. Now the next one, which is another big one, is block periodization. And what we're really looking at there is, are we using short but more focused blocks targeting specific qualities? And by that, what I mean is, are we having let's say a 4 to 6 week block of just strength training? Are we then using another 4 to 6 week block for power training? And that can be really good for athletes, and it's really good for peaking for certain events. So if you're doing an event where it's more focused on strength rather than endurance, then you might have very early stages of the periodization cycle where you look at endurance before then progressing on to strength just before the event. And that's really good for those elite athletes, but it does come at a cost, where if you are looking at endurance and then you move on to, let's say, hypertrophy, and then you look at then strength, what's going to happen is those endurance adaptations that you've picked up during the early stages are going to be neglected as you move from stage to stage, and by the time you get to that power stage, the effort that you've put in on the endurance block is going to be there's going to be nothing there to measure how much progress you've made. You're going to lose it all in that time frame that you've spent progressing through hypertrophy to then strength. So it is important that we recognize what sports they're actually really good for, and primarily it would be more powerlifting and strongman type activities, or anything really that focuses more on strength and power, where you can get away with a little bit of neglect of endurance. Now, I can give you loads of information on different types of periodization, how they might be used, what the benefits are, limitations, criticisms, and also some practical recommendations on how we might actually utilize those different methods and who for. But I am a bit conscious of time in regards to how long this video is going to end up going on for, because I've waffled on a little bit. So instead of just waffling through that, what I'm going to do is just put a table on at the very end, and you can have a look at the different methods of periodization and what those benefits, limitations and guidelines are really, or recommendations are for coaches to use them and implement them. So I hope you've took on board some of the information that I've given you, hopefully. So with that in mind, like, comment and subscribe would be really appreciated, and I'll see you next time.